Conspiracy theories, misinformation, and pseudoscience are nothing new. But in the past decade, and especially the last 5 years or so, there seems to be an uptick in those who believe in them, sometimes at the cost of their own health and well-being. There's also an increase in those who simply mistrust science altogether. So, whose responsibility is it to advocate for science, to help change public discourse? Are we properly preparing engineers and scientists to be the advocates of their own discoveries? More importantly, how do we engage with a non-scientific community so that they can begin to trust science again? What I love about Dr. Gabriel Potvin's approach to this problem is that it's one of empathy and curiosity. Special guest host Dr. Jenna Usprech and I sat down with Dr. Potvin to learn more about his experience and his insights as a professor of teaching at UBC. Welcome to SBME Interfaces. Today, we are interfacing with Gabriel Potvin, who is an associate professor of teaching at UBC's Chemical and Biomedical Engineering. He is an award-winning educator, including the Undergraduate Teaching Excellence Award from 2017 through 2021, a 2019 Ron Britton Engineering Education Vanguard Award, and a UBC Killam Teaching Award in 2021. His work focuses on laboratory education, problem-based learning, interdisciplinary education, bioprocessing, industrial microbiology, microalgal, is that correct? Yeah. Okay, good, okay, cool. Microalgal biotechnology and sustainable engineering. Now, the reason he's with us today is that he recently gave a talk at SBME titled Nonsense and Sustainability: How Understanding Flat Earthers, Anti-Vaxxers, and Other Conspiracy Theorists Can Help Us Become Better Engineers. The talk took a brief look at why conspiracy theorist groups like Flat Earthers and Anti-Vaxxers exist and discussed their impact on the work of engineers, as well as how we currently educate engineers. It was a huge hit, and there were plenty of questions left unanswered that we hope to take a look at today. And also joining us is our wonderful guest host, the incomparable Dr. Jenna Usprech, who is assistant professor of teaching at SBME, and educator extraordinaire and staunch advocate for science communication. So welcome to the both of you.
Happy to be here.
Okay, so one of the more common questions that was asked, or at least some permutation of this was asked by multiple people, was sort of surrounded the idea of responsibility. So one audience member summed it up pretty well, so I'll just quote them. There seems to be an element of us versus them in all of this that often leads to non-scientists feeling like they're being spoken down to. I think even listening to this talk could have some non-scientists tuning out or even possibly angry. So even explaining the problem as scientists could put people on guard against the message that we are trying to convey. I don't know if scientists are the ones to make the societal changes we would need to implement and increase trust in science. Who do you think would be better equipped to handle this? Politicians, celebrities? And there's a little bit more, but that's basically the gist of it. Is like, whose responsibility do you think it is?
So we're starting with a light question here, I guess.
Yeah. Diving right in.
So to address the first point, valid, right? Like, and I guess it's a question of audience here. I was asked to talk to a room full of engineers. And so the way we discuss this, the whole point I want to stress of this talk was also to generate some empathy for these, let's call them non-scientific positions here, and where these conspiracies theorists are coming from, and why we care as engineers that they hold these kind of beliefs and how we can better communicate with them. Absolutely right that if we were talking to, if this was a talk that was aimed for the public, obviously the language would change a little bit because the purpose of the talk is different. So really, like, if I gave the impression I had anything other than kind of sympathy, or if that was my message, that certainly wasn't the intent. But the point is kind of well taken here. But at the same time, we have this framework that we use in science and engineering that, allows us, to the best of our abilities, I know this is a loaded question too, but it allows us to approach the problems with objectivity and develop useful tools that are tested against objective standards. And the metric that we use is, does it work or not? Is it going to have the effect that we have or not? And to undercut that by saying, because someone else doesn't believe that this is valid, then we should pander to a different group, or we should kind of listen to. I think we should listen to the position, but because we should accept the position as equal, that is also not, in my opinion, an acceptable kind of position to take, or even a desirable position to take, right? So as to who would be best to kind of get people on board, yes, politicians and celebrities have their role, because again, we actually talked about this, right? These are people that have a voice that people listen to and whose job it is to relate to people. That's in the job description of a kind of politician. So they have a role to play, but kind of the message I was getting to also is that we can't abdicate that entire role as scientists or engineers. It's not they'll take care of the communication and making sure people are on board. We have to be part of that conversation, and we have stuff to contribute here. We have stuff to say, and I think to abdicate that responsibility is a bit of a mistake on our part, and it's one that's easy to make, right? So we're all here at kind of UBC and engineering departments. We're surrounded by engineers all the time. We're in a kind of isolated bubble, so to speak, and so it's easy to kind of forget or given we interface with other engineers or other scientists primarily. But there's a bigger world out there, and to not engage with that world, I think, is a mistake and something we should not be doing. So hopefully that answers a little bit of that question there.
Yeah, I think maybe there's a tie into this next question that came up based on, you saying that scientists and engineers do have a proper role there, and maybe they are the appropriate people, but there's still some sort of disconnect. Do you think that post-secondary institutions are properly preparing young engineers to be advocates for science?
So this goes to a kind of question, and maybe, I mean, I know we were chatting this some other time, but when I became a professor, so my background, my PhD is in the technical field, right? And so the things that we do to train us to hold our positions as kind of educators in post-secondary educations are purely technical in nature. We have to be able to do the science, to do the engineering, to communicate that kind of out and demonstrate some impact on the technology. And it's not really that training doesn't lend itself well, or maybe doesn't lend itself naturally to the skills that we need in order to be kind of good educators, right? To talk to people who are not yet at the same technical level and to kind of bring them up, right? Which is what we do, help them discover all the wonderful things of the universe and kind of have them kind of share that. So are we doing enough kind of with the undergrad? I think that's a continuation of that, right? Like we have these undergraduate students for these 4 years or 5 years. And there's a lot they have to know to be competent engineers. We do integrate some of these concepts of, consulting with stakeholders and dealing with people. Are we doing enough? I mean, you'll get a different answer. If you talk to 10 different people, you get 10 different answers. Personally, probably not, right? We focus a lot on technical criteria, which is good in an engineering degree. It's normal. We do have some constraints in terms of the topics and the number of hours we have to spend on science and design because of it's a professional program that's kind of accredited. And so there's requirements there. We also don't want to keep, or at least the students don't want to be kept here for 7, 8, 9 years to get a kind of holistic kind of training here that, they'll develop those skills over their careers as well. So are we doing enough? Probably not, but some people are, right? So there is a push for this interdisciplinary education, for community engaged learning, where part of the outcomes of a program result from students participating in projects in the community and working with people to develop real solutions to real problems and getting people involved in that. And those are wonderful opportunities. But as you can imagine, it's difficult to do well. It's difficult to scale. We have lots of success stories. We have a lot of kind of failures there too. So it's an ongoing process. So could we be doing more? Sure. Are we doing nothing? No, I'll argue we are doing kind of something, but we could probably approach this with at least creating the perception that this idea of dealing with the public is more important than just a design criteria in our process. So we can probably start there maybe as increasing that as something of value.
Mm-hmm. And the approaches and the tools used, by non-engineers and engineers in this space are obviously different. But have you found any used sort of in the public sphere that you think like almost immediately apply? Like, oh, I can take this and I can apply this to engineers to help them learn to go back out in the world and speak that. Any specific things that you've encountered?
I can point to a few types of activities here, but it has to come first from a kind of willingness, right? There has to be a value proposition for the engineers to say, let's do this. This is a good thing, right? And we have some kind of students that, yeah, they think this is great and this is worthwhile, and others that don't necessarily see the value, and we can give a better kind of value proposition there. But there's a lot of activities that are done to kind of connect scientists and engineers and the kind of public that I think are effective as a first step, right? So we have all of these internal kind of presentations. Let's have more of these presentations open to the public. Let's have, we have these UBC applied science open house days where people can come in and kind of visit the different departments. Let's do this with thesis projects for students. If they're presenting their research here, let's open that to the public and let's publicize that. I participated in the past in some events that were called Café Scientifique, right? You go to a cafe, you go to a bar, you have a coffee or a beer, and there's some panels there, but it's a public event. People come in, they engage with a question. It's not kind of formal. It's an opportunity to kind of explore, discuss a topic. Those types of events will reach a population that's kind of interested in this kind of thing. So I think this is not a new problem in academia, right? Like we talk about ivory towers and how we're kind of separated from reality and everything like that. So I think there's ways to kind of break down that tower a little bit and just make it possible, right? Give official opportunities for people to come in and to kind of see the kind of stuff that we do. And I think if we do more of that, that's one step on the way to kind of, if not breaking down the barriers, at least making the material a little bit more accessible. Hopefully that makes sense.
I think that makes a lot of sense. You talk about opening things up to the public and give some good examples of that. What's your take on a platform like SciHub? Do you think that's a good way to free science or help non-scientists or engineers get closer to that information?
SciHub, you mean like access to the publications?
Yeah, like open access, I guess.
So sure. But there's, giving access to scientific material like this is good. And I think having access to this is a good thing for society in general. I understand the barriers and the logistical constraints of doing all of this, but having access to this work, I think, and more transparency would be good. But this kind of ties into, there's another obstacle here that just making every scientific paper kind of free won't solve. And this is something, in that talk I kind of point to, which is science and engineering is very inaccessible, right? There are barriers to accessibility here for people that don't engage it long term, which is just to say, like any field for that matter, but the science and engineering is hard. It takes a lot of time and effort to just get in the mindset of kind of science and technology, let alone kind of get the foundation in the material that you need to understand and build a model of how the universe works. So we teach first year, second year, third year students where we're covering material that's the kind of foundation of what they're going to use as engineers going forward to create all the wonderful designs and understand the universe and all these wonderful inventions. But all of that rests on a foundation that they had in kind of first year and then kind of high school and need a sustained kind of interest. And we talked about, like in Canada, which is one of the most educated populations in the world, we have 1 in 10 people that have any kind of STEM training, right? So science, technology, engineering, or math beyond high school. So we have 9 out of 10 that don't. And that's, I just maybe to that first question, that doesn't mean these people are not smart, are not capable, or not wonderful members of society. That just means they don't speak the same language. They don't have the same foundational knowledge in these fields that is necessary to engage it with a higher level. If, we can make all scientific papers available, if you don't have that kind of foundation to go in and understand and critique and contextualize what you're looking at, that may not be that useful. Like, I don't think some of the challenges that we have is because our scientific papers are not accessible enough, right? But that's certainly something that would be great, and I think is a good step.
It clicks directly into the next question as well, talking about that language barrier, right? Like that overly technical language keeps people on the outside of scientific knowledge. So how, like in your opinion, how would you sort of advise people to navigate the desire to communicate at a more public level, but also the necessity of communicating at a very technical level when it comes to scientific publication?
Yeah, and I don't think, there's one that's better than the other. It's one or the other, right? Like when we're talking to other engineers, the technical language makes sense, right? Like we need the precise terminology to be able to communicate and to work on these higher level things. These are things that are not necessary to know. A lot of these terms are things that are not necessarily to know or understand, to engage in a fruitful discussion about the role of technology in society, or to make informed decisions in our kind of everyday lives related to technology. We still have some compartmentalization of kind of skills in society where, some people are doing kind of this role, some people are doing this role, and the role that engineers are doing requires that kind of jargon. And so I don't think that's a bad thing. So that's kind of goes in, as you say, with that last thing we talked about, which is, access to scientific papers is great, but the purpose of scientific papers is not public outreach. But at the same time, when we are talking to our audience, and this is actually something we spend some time talking to our students about, we have to consider the audience and the context. And so the role of talking to the public, or the context of that, is not the same. Then jargon doesn't really matter. And this, I actually kind of tried to make this a point kind of during that talk, which is, I think scientists and engineers have to get comfortable when they want to deal with the public to discuss, different degrees of truth. And the example I said, we can say the earth is flat and we know that's wrong, but if we say the earth is round, that's also wrong, because the earth is not a perfect sphere, it's slightly kind of flatter in one end or the other. As scientists or engineers, we are trained on the technical side to be precise and to be accurate with what we say, and we're not comfortable when we say things that aren't quite true. I think we have to get away from that a little bit in that context of dealing with the public, which is, it's more like, people might think it's condescending when I say this, telling stories. I don't mean that, right? When I say telling stories, I mean like building narratives that people can relate to, helping people assemble model of how things work kind of in their head. Teaching does a lot of that, right? Good teaching tells stories, even in engineering, to kind of follow a narrative thread as we kind of go through. And so if we get a little bit more comfortable with, let's not worry about the jargon, about the details, let's just get the core concepts, the ideas through. Let's get people involved. Let's make the work that we do accessible and kind of understandable, even if it's not at the detailed equation kind of jargon level. I think that's a kind of big step that we can do. It's not something we get much training for. It's not something that's particularly valued, I would argue, in an undergraduate or graduate degree, because of the context in which those things are pursued. But it is something I think that's important, and that, artists and politicians understand very well. This kind of communication with the kind of public. So that kind of ties into another question there about the role of kind of politicians and celebrities, where they have that skill set. So there's, but it's not a all or nothing kind of thing. I think we just need to make a bit more effort in that vein.
It's funny, author E. Paul Zare, when he was on the show, he sort of said something similar, where he was talking about the scientist's fear of saying something that's only 80% right, or only 90% right? And I think that's he was talking about, like, we need to get away from that if we want to really properly communicate science, right there. Like, it's okay to just, nutshell it, and it's okay to not go into those details.
Yeah. Agreed, but I think it's a measure of context, because if you're speaking at a technical conference when you're surrounded by people that speak the same language as you, then you don't want to say something that's 80% right, only because you'll be called out on it, right? But when dealing with the public, that's not the point. That's not the goal that we want. This is not a kind of technical conference. This is a conversation that we have to get people kind of in the same kind of context here. And I want to stress here, we talk about science and engineering because we're scientists and engineers here. But it's the same thing. I worked with some colleagues of mine in political science and linguistics, and they showed me some of the work that they're doing, and I don't understand a word of it. There's an inaccessibility there too, right? Like, I can't discuss those concepts with them at the level that they are able to discuss it and they do with their peers. And so there's that same level of barrier that I think we see here. So I'm really not placing science and engineering as special here. Maybe I'm putting it as specialized is probably a better way to kind of say it. Yeah.
I think that's really interesting, Gabriel. I agree with you on creating a narrative and not creating more barriers or things to divide people. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, maybe a bit of a lighter angle. what impact do you think comedy shows and late shows have that often treat people who ascribe to misinformation and conspiracies as a punchline or something to laugh at? Do you think that has an impact on the situation, and what might that be?
Yeah, I mean, look, I'm talking. We're going to delve a bit into sociology here, which I am not a sociologist, right? But I can give you my sense of this, and you know what we tend to see. Yeah, so the goal of kind of comedy shows, or the goal of kind of entertainment, is just that, right? It's entertainment. The same factors we were talking about kind of during my talk of why people get drawn to conspiracy kind of theorists are, you know, the people laughing at those conspiracy theories are subject to those as well, right? So what I mean by this, so some person might be drawn to kind of flat earth or something because it makes them feel kind of special, right? As kind of holders of the truth, as someone who has value, who has access to something that others don't. Every human being wants that, right? Scientists and engineers too. We're drawn to that, and we derive some self-worth from those kind of positions. And so if people are deriving kind of that kind of self-worth from kind of holding that position, we get the same thing, we being kind of everyone else, by laughing at those positions, right? Which is a ingrained kind of tendency to say like, no, like they think they hold the truth, but they're wrong. I hold the truth. I know the earth is not flat. And so to make that kind of separation, I think is if not good, but it's probably natural, right? To hold as a kind of entertainment vessel. That unfortunately though, that exacerbates the problem, right? Which is when we do it for the laughs, when we do it for the punchline, that doesn't leave much room for introspection, which is, well, why do they hold that position, right? That wouldn't make for a very good comedy show to have that kind of conversation there. And the problem is the less you treat other people with empathy, you know, something my parents always told me growing up, which is people won't remember what you tell them, but they'll remember how they were treated by you, right? Which is the more we kind of hit on that on the comedic side, the more people are going to withdraw, right? And kind of dig into kind of that position, which is, no, like you're wrong, you're laughing at me, but I'll have the last laugh because I have the position. So I think things like that makes things worse. And that's why, you know, in the 40-minute presentation or so that kind of I kind of gave last time, we can't look at these topics in too much nuance here, but this is a big, complicated fabric of society, structure of society, and kind of education and public discourse that we have. It doesn't have a kind of simple solution, but I think the impact of these kind of comedy routines against this are further driving people away. But at the same time, right, just to be a contrarian here a bit to my own point, at the same time, you know, it's people relate to comedians and people relate to celebrities, and they have a role to play in this kind of discourse, right? So if you have a comedian that you like, that doesn't necessarily talk about scientific topics, right? But you relate to this person, you're a fan. And all of a sudden they start talking about, well, maybe you should get vaccinated. And they have a you know, it's a fine line, but they have a routine here that will kind of navigate that line into getting you to think about your position while also kind of being funny. That's going to help. It's going to push away the staunchly anti-vaccination people, but it's going to, those people that are on the fence might kind of come a little bit more to your side and be a little bit more receptive to the message. So yeah, so you know, communication between people is a complicated thing. But as a whole, if I have to pick a position, I'll say it's probably not a good thing. It does create that us versus them kind of mentality, or this idea that science and technology is separate from the rest, right? It's something that we can opt out of, which I don't think we can.
This kind of sticks to the next question a little bit too, and something that we talked about briefly before we started, which was, you know, kind of what brought you into this space was effectively a curiosity, right? And I think when people are asking for, like, do you have any tips or do you have any advice for dealing with somebody who is, you know, staunchly anti-vax or staunchly, you know, whatever it might be, I think kind of what you've been circling here is your tip might be empathy and curiosity, like actual empathy and curiosity. Could you go into that a little bit?
I think that's the only solution, right? Because telling someone you're wrong or you're stupid or something like that doesn't work, right? And a lot of these people, don't take these positions out of malice. I mean, maybe we can find some, but people who are anti-vaccination don't come to this position to harm others, right? It comes out of a variety of factors that makes sense to them. So to have that empathy, we need to establish a level of trust between two people to be able to have a productive discussion. Without that trust, never mind. If I come in and say, get vaccinated, you need to, and the other person doesn't trust me, and they've come to this position through their own reasons, their own kind of life circumstances or kind of experiences, or their own lack of trust in a kind of system, that comes a bit from this inaccessibility to kind of scientific knowledge, then it's very difficult. So the idea is to have that empathy and not to yell at people for their positions, but to say where are you coming from, right? And the other person has to be receptive to having this discussion too, right? It's not a one-sided thing. We need to have a kind of open discussion on both sides and a desire to kind of get through a position of truth, even if we don't agree on everything. But that's really the only way we can go about it, is to build that level of trust. And so maybe, as an example, you go to, a non-vaccine related kind of question. You go to the doctor and they say, okay, you're sick, you have this disease, you have to take this medicine. I'm not equipped to know what's in this kind of medication or whether it's going to be effective or whether the diagnostic is right. But there's a level of trust there. It's a level of trust that's been built over time between me and the medical profession and me and this individual doctor. And if this doctor starts lying to me or not acting in my best interest, I'm not going to trust them at all, right? In fact, I'm going to be quite skeptical of the rest, and maybe a more kind of, let's say, less medical reason. Same thing with your car mechanic, right? Car breaks down, you bring them in, and if you establish, you probably start off with a position of mistrust that they're going to try to kind of overcharge you for parts and services you don't need. But if you build that relationship with a particular person and you trust that they're not overcharging you and they're acting in your best interest, then you have that great relationship and you're going to trust them. And when they do tell you you're going to need to kind of replace this part of your engine, you don't question that, right? Or you're able to have that discussion at least to kind of see whether or not that's really necessary, and will trust their expertise and their judgment in that case. So I think that's a solution. And I mean, I say this is a solution that I have no idea how to get to, but it's to establish that kind of trust and that empathy, that when someone comes out and says, we should all get vaccinated against this, then there's more of that level of trust with that. And like I said, that's a bigger problem that we're going to solve today, I think.
Yeah. The next question was related to building trust, but I think you've spoken a lot about how you think that can happen and kind of building better relationships and using empathy and, I guess, more kindness into talking to people who have different viewpoints than your own. I guess I'll flip the question and see if you have an idea of how do you repair trust that's been broken? Because clearly people have broken trust with scientists and doctors. How do you think we can go about repairing that?
I don't know. This is something that's difficult. And I could tell you things like, keep a dialogue open and kind of get people on board and build a kind of network and more transparency, all of which is going to contribute to this. But once trust is broken, it's difficult. And this is, we're talking, just use the example of vaccines. And, I have empathy and understanding. I don't agree with them, but I have empathy and understanding for people who don't want to get vaccinated. And when you're looking from their perspective, it's, you're going to inject this thing that you do not have the tools to understand. And, it's going to make you sick for a couple of days, but it's going to protect others, right? Or it's going to protect yourself and others kind of going forward. And so if you don't have trust in that, how do you convince someone that what you're asking them to do in the scenario I just told you is perfectly legitimate. If a random person on the street comes up and asks you, like, I have this syringe injected and it's going to be good for you, like you're not going to kind of engage with it, rightfully so. And so repairing trust once it's lost, once there has been a betrayal, once there's been like too much cynicism brought into it, is incredibly difficult. And we see this as teachers too, right? So as teachers, regardless of everything, which is, students have a certain level of kind of trust in us, that they're going to be treated fairly, that, we know what we're talking about and in the kind of lessons that we put together. Doesn't mean we can't make mistakes, but if we make a mistake kind of every 15 minutes while kind of doing work on the board, students stop listening to us, and getting that trust back is incredibly difficult. So I know I'm circling kind of this answer because I don't have a good answer kind of for you, other than kind of time and effort. And it's less about the individuals and more about the community, the society, and getting as many individuals as kind of possible, I think.
Now I'm really cognizant of the time. Can we have you for a couple more questions? Is that cool?
Sure.
All right. So light and breezy, what advice do you have for the burgeoning engineers out there who also want to get deeper into the communication space for science?
Yeah, I think it's just have fun with it and don't be afraid to kind of jump in. I mentioned some types of events like this that are kind of publicly organized, right? Like the value proposition is pretty good. You throw in a topic, get a couple of engineers or scientists, members of the public, say, come have a coffee, come have a beer, kind of the local kind of place, and people are going to show up, right? And if we have these kind of openness here, if you're working on a cool project, kind of post about it, right? Like I personally dislike social media, while at the same time really kind of appreciating the effect that kind of social media has, and as a platform to be able to kind of disseminate some of this. And I think the advice is just to have fun, which kind of ties into what one of your previous guests was saying about it's okay to be 80% right only, right? But it's to kind of engage with that in the professional sphere as well, right? It's to get away. During an undergrad degree, we say that consulting stakeholders is a design requirement. So in the projects that most undergraduate students do, it's like, okay, like this is the opinion of people, and we know what we're allowed to do, and kind of these are rules that if we have to kind of do it, people won't be happy, but we can, and these are lines that we can't cross. Once we've established that, they become design criteria. You don't have to deal with people anymore. Here's our wonderful kind of technical invention. In reality, it has to be an ongoing kind of dialogue here with people. And I think just getting in that mindset, even if we don't change anything in education, just getting in that mindset, which is we're doing it this way because we have one course, we have one term, we have X number of hours to kind of work with. But in reality, like this is something that's kind of broader, and to have that kind of discussion, I think will be a big step. But for everyone who wants to get into this, is just go out and communicate. A lot of people are interested, just don't have access, and we get those people first. And then it's the people that are more recalcitrant or that have lack of trust. But then you're coming at it with a much bigger group, a much more diverse group that's not just scientists and engineers. So again, these are big, long-term, fundamental shift in the way we do things that they're not going to happen overnight, but I think is where we have to go.
Great. What do you hope to see in the next 5 years in this space?
What I hope to see? I think just more transparency, right? And more communication, even within the university, even within kind of different disciplines, and getting people involved. There's a few projects kind of popping up that are trying to kind of do this. I think just like an engagement with the public as just something we do and we're supposed to do, right? As something kind of normal as part of our kind of departmental obligations here. I would love to see more scientists and engineers kind of doing these public events. I'd actually love to see more scientists and engineers running for office, right? Which is something, it's not something we're trained for. And I mean, stereotypically, it's not something engineers are well suited for either. Although, that's obviously not the case. But I'd like to see people more engaged with this, right? And to see, instead of seeing kind of a a kind of well-defined barrier of kind of this is what we do, this is what we don't do, have that kind of fuzzy area in the middle. So not all engineers are going to become politicians, but I know a few that could. I even have a few students kind of graduating every year that I'd vote for them if they ran for kind of a government position. And so I think it's just a kind of slow integration of this as a necessity, as this is a reality of the way we do things in university that I think would be great. Be great to see it in elementary and high school as well, right? Like to have an expectation. Again, not that teachers are going to be professional scientists or engineers, but to value that, probably they should have some basic training in science and engineers. I remember, so I did my elementary school in Ontario, so it might be a little bit different in BC, but I remember my grade 8 teacher, fantastic teacher, right? I remember him kind of fondly. No background in science. We did very little kind of science at that stage, right? Now, I'm not saying he did his job kind of poorly, quite the opposite. But perhaps that's not a good thing, right? Perhaps that's, it's treated as one of these things that it's nice to have, but if you don't have it, no problem, you can still do the job. And it's the same thing, when we're talking about the kind of entertainment industry kind of earlier, which is when we're writing scripts and things like that, then it's rarely does the hero of the story come to a realization that let's put feelings aside and kind of let's go the kind of scientific route and that's what's going to save the day. Often it's the opposite, right? They come to the realization that I'm much too focused on kind of science and kind of reason and objectivities, and it's perfectly fine to discard because the outcome is whatever, they win the day or whatever the positive outcome is that movie. So I think slowly I think there needs to be this fuzziness in terms of the boundary between what is science or not, and more engagement and more expectation. And maybe the last thing kind of on this, which would be a nice kind of step, which is, all of our engineering students, and I had to go to this too, I'm sure you did too, we have to take humanities courses, right? Specifically courses that are non-science or engineering. And the idea is so we're kind of better, kind of well-rounded. The opposite is not always true. It's not always true that someone in arts has to have a fundamental understanding of kind of science or engineering. I'm not talking about specialization, but just like a course on the scientific method and what it is scientists and kind of engineers do, and maybe, a basic biology, chemistry. We can argue kind of which course kind of would be best, but the opposite is not always true. And I'm not sure I don't think that's a good thing. I think even something like this would kind of give more of that fuzziness between the boundaries. So there's a short list in there somewhere of things I'd like to see over the next 5 years. But I think these are all kind of small incremental things that might help things.
I love that. Okay, so last question of the day. Are there any particular initiatives or projects or endeavors that you are overseeing right now that you are really excited about and you think we should get excited about too?
Oh boy. So I'm involved in a kind of number of things here, but I maybe not something I'm involved with much anymore, but it's something I really appreciated during my own graduate studies. I did some work with an organization called Let's Talk Science, right? They send graduate students in science and engineering to elementary and high schools to do fun, hands-on kind of activities to supplement the science curriculum, give those poor teachers a bit of a break too while they're in the kind of classroom. And that program is fantastic for the people taking part in the activities, but also for the graduate students to develop those communication skills. And, I once did DNA extraction from a banana with kindergartners. And so, to communicate what DNA is and kind of what we're going to do with kind of that activity when you're dealing with kind of 5 or 6 year olds was so much fun, but also kind of a valuable exercise in taking these concepts, taking that story that we want out of them and kind of building that in. So I think activities like this are really fantastic. I am working with a colleague from political science on developing a course on humanitarian engineering. So that would be taken by both political science students and engineering students. So this came out a bit of the idea where I'd work with kind of engineers who are working on these technical things that have no conception of, well, people are actually going to have to use this. And at the same time, we talk to political science kind of students like, well, you know, access to clean drinking water is a human right. And you're like, yeah, I agree. And that's fantastic. Like, how do we do it? Right? It's a big problem. And the response is usually like, we did the hard work by declaring it a human right. You go deal with kind of the technical considerations. And obviously it's much, much harder than that, right? So there needs to be this multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary collaboration here. So I'm working with a student here. We got it approved by Faculty of Arts as well as Faculty of Applied Science. Now we're just trying to get it off the ground. So it's small things like this, I think, that would be good. And yeah, how about we leave it at that?
Sure. Well, this is amazing. Both of you are extraordinary in this space. It's a space that means a lot to me, the science communication situation. And I know, like, Jenna, you made a course last year specifically around this. So for both of you, I wanted to thank you just both for your time and for your efforts in this space. You are making a difference, and I can't wait to see what you guys do next.
Thank you, Gabriel. It's a wonderful chat. Thanks, Miguel.